A waitress noticed three men quietly surrounding a table in a crowded Chicago restaurant. 15 minutes later, someone was supposed to die. But when she warned the target, she discovered he wasn't the victim. He was the most dangerous man in the room. Some stories about love begin with a kiss. Some begin with a chance meeting. But the story you are about to hear begins with something far more unsettling. It begins with a waitress quietly realizing that three men in a crowded restaurant are preparing to kill someone, and the man about to die is sitting only a few feet away from her table. And here's the strangest part. The moment she warned him, he didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed. That was the first sign Elena Morrison should have understood that the man she had been serving wine to every Friday night was not just another wealthy customer enjoying dinner in downtown Chicago. He was something else entirely. And by the time she realized what kind of man Antonio Bandini truly was, it was already too late to walk away. Hello everyone, and welcome to Rose's Stories. If you enjoy dark romance stories where love grows in the shadow of danger and impossible choices, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you more stories like this. Because tonight's story is not just about love. It's about the strange moment when curiosity pulls an ordinary person into a world they were never meant to enter. And once that door opens, it rarely closes again. The Golden Fork restaurant looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing dangerous was supposed to happen. Warm lighting spilled across polished marble floors. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight on every table. Soft jazz drifted through the room, blending with the quiet hum of conversations between couples celebrating anniversaries, businessmen discussing deals, and friends relaxing after long work weeks. It was the kind of environment designed to feel safe, controlled, predictable. Elena Morrison moved through the dining room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years mastering the invisible choreography of restaurant work. At 26, she knew how to carry 3 plates in one hand without spilling a drop of wine. She knew how to read a table's mood before customers spoke. She knew how to smile politely even when her feet hurt and her shift still had 3 hours left. But what most people in that room did not know was that Elena had once studied criminal psychology. Before medical bills swallowed her savings. Before her mother's illness forced her to abandon graduate school and take whatever work paid the rent. That education left her with a strange habit. She noticed things. The way people breathed when they were nervous. The way someone's eyes moved when they were lying. The small unconscious gestures that appear right before someone does something they cannot take back. And that night, those signals were everywhere. At table 8, a man in an expensive charcoal suit had ordered 3 drinks in the past hour and touched none of them. His back was straight. His shoulders tense. Every few minutes, he checked his watch with the mechanical precision of someone waiting for a specific moment. At the bar, another man sat with a glass of whiskey he barely sipped. He had positioned himself where he could see both the front entrance and the hallway leading to the kitchen. His posture was too alert for someone relaxing after work. Then there was the third man. He sat near the hallway that led to the back exit. The same exit Elena had watched Antonio Bandini use many times when leaving the restaurant. And every few minutes, each of those men looked toward the same table. Table 12, where Antonio Bandini sat alone. Now, if you've ever studied behavioral patterns the way Elena had, you learn something important very quickly. Danger rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers through patterns. 1 man watching another might be coincidence. 2 might be curiosity. But 3? 3 men placed strategically around a room, all maintaining visual contact with the same target, all checking the time, all pretending not to watch. That is not coincidence. That is preparation. Elena noticed something else too. Their movements were synchronized in a subtle way. A glance, a shift of posture, a hand brushing a jacket pocket. The quiet signals people exchange when they are part of the same plan. And suddenly, Elena felt that cold, familiar sensation she remembered from her psychology classes. The moment when observation turns into understanding. Someone in this room was about to get hurt. She looked toward table 12 again. Antonio Bandini sat exactly as he always did, calm, composed, perfectly dressed in a tailored dark suit that made him look less like a restaurant customer and more like someone who owned the entire building. He had storm gray eyes that seemed to study the room without ever appearing obvious about it. Even the way he held his wine glass carried a kind of careful control. Everything about him suggested a man used to being watched. but not a man afraid of it. That was when Elena noticed the man at table 8 lift his phone and turn slightly away. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but Elena heard enough. 23:45, back exit. Everything's in position. Her heart skipped. 23:45 was 15 minutes away, and the back exit was exactly the route Antonio Bandini always used when leaving the Golden Fork. For a moment Elena told herself she might be wrong. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe years of studying criminal behavior had made her see danger where none existed. But deep down she knew that feeling. The quiet certainty that comes when small pieces suddenly form a complete picture. 3 men, strategic positions, a specific time, a planned exit route, and a target who had no idea what was waiting for him outside. Elena picked up the bottle of Barolo Antonio ordered every week and walked toward table 12. Her hands felt steady. Her mind was racing. Because sometimes a single decision can quietly divide your life into 2 parts. The life you had before, and the life that begins the moment you decide not to stay silent. Elena placed the wine on the table and leaned slightly closer, pretending to adjust the position of the glass. Then she whispered the sentence that would change everything. Mr. Bandini, I think someone is planning to kill you. That single whisper, Mr. Bandini, I think someone is planning to kill you, did not only interrupt a quiet dinner. It quietly opened the door to a story that had actually begun long before Elena Morrison ever stepped into the Golden Fork. Because people often imagine that moments like this appear suddenly, out of nowhere, like lightning in a clear sky. But when you look closer, you start to realize that every turning point in life has roots stretching backward through years of choices, losses, and quiet compromises. And Elena's life, before that moment, had been anything but simple. If you had walked past her on the street a few months earlier, you probably would have seen nothing unusual. Just another young woman moving quickly through downtown Chicago, headphones in, coffee in hand, heading to work. At 26, Elena had the kind of face people described as calm rather than striking. Thoughtful gray-blue eyes, blonde hair usually pulled into a loose knot, the sort of quiet confidence that came from years of studying people rather than trying to impress them. But beneath that calm exterior was a mind that had been trained to look deeper than most people ever bothered to. Elena had studied criminal psychology. It had once been more than just a field of study for her. It had been a plan, a future. She imagined working with behavioral analysis teams, helping investigators understand the patterns behind violent crime, the way small behaviors reveal intention long before a crime actually happens. But plans have a way of collapsing when life introduces something you cannot negotiate with. For Elena, that something had been a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and hopelessness. Her mother had been diagnosed with lung cancer 3 years earlier. At first, the doctors spoke in the careful language of optimism, treatment options, promising therapies, months that might stretch into years. Elena believed them because believing felt easier than imagining the alternative. What followed instead was a long sequence of treatments that slowly drained everything her family had built. Savings disappeared first. Then Elena's graduate school plans. Then the small comforts that once made their apartment feel like home. Medical bills piled up in quiet stacks on the kitchen table. Elena learned how to navigate insurance forms, hospital departments, and financial assistance programs with the exhausted determination of someone fighting a battle she knew she could not win. By the time her mother died, Elena had become intimately familiar with a truth that no one ever teaches in school. Hard work does not always protect you from loss, and intelligence does not always guarantee control over your own life. When the funeral ended and the quiet reality of an empty apartment settled around her, Elena made the only practical decision available. She took a job. The Golden Fork restaurant had been hiring experienced service staff, and Elena discovered she had a natural ability for the work. Restaurants run on observation, on timing, on reading people's moods before they ask for anything. Those skills were surprisingly similar to the behavioral analysis she had studied in school. Customers thought waitresses simply carried plates. In reality, good waitresses read entire emotional landscapes across a dining room. Who was celebrating? Who was arguing quietly? Who was lying during a business negotiation? And sometimes, who did not belong. That was how Elena first noticed Antonio Bandini. At first he had simply been another customer, tall, impeccably dressed, arriving alone and requesting the same table each Friday evening. But over time, Elena began to realize that Antonio behaved differently from the other wealthy diners who filled the restaurant. Most people entered a room expecting comfort. Antonio entered a room expecting calculation. He always chose a seat with a clear view of every entrance. His posture remained relaxed, but never careless. His eyes moved in slow, deliberate patterns across the space, as if he were quietly mapping everyone present. Elena had watched him do this for weeks. Not because she was fascinated with him in the romantic sense people might imagine, but because something about his presence triggered the analytical part of her mind. Antonio moved like a man who expected trouble to appear at any moment. And yet, he kept coming back. Every Friday. The same time. The same table. The same bottle of Barolo. Sometimes he brought business associates. Sometimes he arrived alone. But even in silence, there was an invisible gravity around him. Other guests occasionally glanced his way without understanding why. Carmen noticed it too, though she interpreted it differently. "He's just one of those rich guys who likes routine," she had told Elena one night while polishing glasses behind the bar. "Honestly, if he keeps tipping like that, he can sit wherever he wants." But Elena had never been completely convinced. Because people who live ordinary lives do not scan restaurant entrances every few minutes. They do not keep their backs to the wall as if instinctively protecting blind spots. And they certainly do not carry the quiet, contained stillness of someone accustomed to surviving dangerous environments. So over time, Antonio Bandini became something unusual in Elena's life. Not a customer. Not quite a mystery either. More like an unanswered question. And on most nights, Elena was content to leave that question alone. Her life was complicated enough. Without wandering into someone else's secrets. She had rent to pay, long shifts to survive, and memories she still hadn't fully processed. But that particular Friday night, something in the air felt different. Even before she heard the whisper about 23:45. Even before the pattern of three men watching the same table revealed itself. Some part of Elena's instincts had already begun to tighten long before her mind caught up with the danger unfolding around them. Because sometimes the most important moments in life don't begin with a dramatic explosion. They begin quietly, with a waitress carrying a bottle of wine toward a man she barely knows, and the uneasy feeling that by the time the night ends, neither of their lives will ever return to what they were before. And sometimes the moment you sense danger isn't the moment the danger actually arrives. It's simply the moment when you realize you are already standing inside it. After Elena whispered her warning, the restaurant did something strange. Or perhaps it was Elena's mind that did something strange. The room seemed to continue moving as if nothing unusual had happened. Waiters crossed the floor carrying plates of pasta and wine. Someone laughed near the bar. A couple at a nearby table clinked glasses, celebrating something private and happy. But inside Elena's chest, everything had shifted. Antonio Bandini did not react the way a normal man would react to the sentence she had just spoken. He did not jump. He did not panic. He did not even ask the obvious question. Instead, his eyes sharpened with a quiet focus that suggested he was not hearing new information. He was confirming something he had already suspected. If you spend enough time studying human behavior, you start to recognize the difference between surprise and recognition. Surprise is messy. It shows in widened eyes, delayed responses, small breaks in posture. Recognition is the opposite. It looks like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Antonio's reaction was recognition. "Explain," he said softly. His voice was so calm that for a second Elena wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe she had misread everything. Maybe she had just accused innocent men of something impossible. But then she remembered the phone call. The timing. The positioning. The way the men kept checking the back exit. 3 men, Elena whispered, forcing herself to stay composed. 1 at table 8. 1 at the bar, 1 near the restroom hallway. They've been watching you for the last hour. Coordinated movements. Surveillance behavior. I heard one of them say 23:45. Back exit. For a brief moment, Antonio said nothing. He simply looked at her. There are people who command attention loudly. They raise their voices, move dramatically, force the room to notice them. Antonio did the opposite. His stillness seemed to bend the air around him. His gray eyes held Elena's gaze in a way that made her feel as though she had just stepped into a conversation far older and more dangerous than she understood. You study behavior, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded once. Antonio reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Elena felt a brief flash of fear, some instinct warning her that the moment was about to change. But instead of a weapon, he removed his phone. He typed something quickly, just a short message. Then he placed the phone face down on the table and lifted his wine glass as if nothing unusual had happened. Done, he said. Elena blinked. Done. Antonio's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though it carried none of the warmth people usually associate with that expression. Insurance. For a few seconds nothing happened, and then the room shifted. It happened so smoothly that most people dining in the restaurant barely noticed anything at all. But Elena saw it immediately. 3 men appeared. They had been inside the restaurant the entire time. That realization alone sent a chill through her. She had been so focused on the 3 suspicious figures that she had completely missed the other side of the equation. Antonio had not been alone. The first man moved toward table 8 with astonishing speed. One moment the man in the charcoal suit was glancing at his watch again. The next moment his arm was twisted behind his back and his face was pressed against the tablecloth. The second man intercepted the customer at the bar before he even had time to react. Their struggle lasted less than 3 seconds before the man was pinned against the counter, his phone sliding across the polished wood. The third suspect near the restroom hallway made the mistake of trying to run. He disappeared into the corridor leading to the back exit. Elena lost sight of him for a moment, but the muffled sounds that followed made it very clear that he had not made it far. Through all of this, Antonio remained seated. That detail stayed with Elena long after the night ended. While chaos quietly unfolded around him, Antonio Bandini finished his wine. He did not rush. He did not look alarmed. It was as if events had simply progressed according to a plan that had already existed in his mind. Only after the situation had fully settled did he stand. He placed a crisp $100 bill on the table. We need to leave, he said. Elena stared at him, trying to process what had just happened. My shift isn't over, she said automatically, though the words sounded absurd even to her own ears. Antonio stepped closer, his presence suddenly much larger than the polite distance he had maintained during their previous visits. Your shift is over. His hand rested gently against the small of her back as he guided her toward the front entrance of the restaurant. The gesture itself was surprisingly careful, but the authority behind it left no room for negotiation. As they walked across the dining room floor, Elena noticed something else. The other customers had barely reacted. A few curious glances. A raised eyebrow. Nothing more. In a strange way, that made the situation even more unsettling. It meant Antonio's people had handled the disruption so smoothly that the illusion of normalcy remained intact. Outside the restaurant, the night air felt colder. A black sedan waited at the curb with its engine running. Antonio opened the rear door and looked at Elena. Get in. For a moment, every rational warning inside Elena's mind screamed at once. She had just watched 3 men disappear in less than a minute. She had just discovered that the quiet customer she had been serving wine to for months traveled with an invisible security team capable of controlling an entire room. Getting into that car meant stepping further into a world she did not understand. But refusing him felt even more dangerous. Because now Elena understood something she hadn't realized before. Antonio Bandini was not simply a man who expected trouble. He was a man whose life had been built around it. And whether she liked it or not, by warning him tonight, she had just become part of that life. So Elena Morrison, the waitress, who once believed she could keep her distance from other people's secrets, took a slow breath and stepped into the car. She had no way of knowing yet that this decision would carry her far beyond the safe edges of the life she once knew. But the moment the door closed behind her, one thing became painfully clear. The world she was entering did not operate by ordinary rules. And the man sitting beside her was only beginning to show her why. The moment the car door closed, Elena understood something that no textbook on human behavior had ever prepared her for. Sometimes the most dangerous decision in life is not the one you make in panic, but the one you make quietly because you feel you have no other choice. The black sedan pulled away from the restaurant with the smooth precision of a vehicle that had done this many times before. Through the tinted window, the warm glow of the golden fork faded behind them, shrinking into just another light among hundreds scattered across downtown Chicago. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Elena sat upright in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to steady the storm of thoughts rushing through her mind. She had just witnessed 3 men being subdued in a matter of seconds. She had stepped into a stranger's car, and that stranger, Antonio Bandini, had responded to a possible assassination attempt with the kind of calm that suggested he had seen much worse. The city lights passed across his face as they drove, revealing sharp lines of concentration in his expression. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the road ahead through the windshield, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of streetlights like steel underwater. "Where are you taking me?" Elena finally asked. Her voice was steadier than she expected. Antonio turned his head slightly, studying her with the same quiet attention he had shown across the restaurant table. "Somewhere safe." The answer was simple. Too simple. Safe from what? Antonio did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in the seat, his posture relaxed but alert, like someone who never fully allowed himself to unwind. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of something Elena had only begun to understand. "From the consequences of what you did tonight." Elena frowned. "You mean warning you?" "Yes." He said it as if the explanation were obvious. "You saved my life," Antonio continued calmly. "People tend to notice when that happens." The sentence lingered in the quiet interior of the car. Elena had spent years studying criminals in textbooks and case files. She knew how organized crime networks functioned in theory. Loyalty structures, power hierarchies, retaliation patterns. But theory and reality are two very different things. In theory, saving someone's life is heroic. In reality, saving the life of a man like Antonio Bandini might simply mean you have just stepped into a war you didn't even know existed. The car turned onto a wide avenue lined with glass towers that stretched upward like polished mirrors reflecting the night sky. Elena recognized the neighborhood immediately. This part of the city belonged to people whose lives operated several economic universes above her own. They pulled into the underground entrance of a luxury residential building. The lobby alone felt like stepping into another world. Polished marble floors reflected soft golden lighting. Large abstract paintings hung on the walls like museum pieces. The air carried the faint scent of expensive wood and citrus cleaning products. Everything about the space communicated quiet wealth, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. But what Elena noticed first were the men. 2 of them stood near the elevator bank. They were dressed like any other well-paid professionals in the building. Dark suits, discreet watches, composed expressions. But the moment Antonio stepped inside, something subtle shifted in the room. Their posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough for someone trained in observation to recognize the signal. Respect. Not casual respect. Structured respect. The kind that belonged to a chain of command. Antonio walked past them without slowing, and they followed a few steps behind, maintaining a precise distance that made their role unmistakably clear. Bodyguards. The elevator ride to the upper floors passed in silence. Elena watched the numbers climb on the digital display while trying to make sense of everything she had just seen. The pieces were beginning to assemble themselves. The calm reaction to the assassination attempt. The invisible security team inside the restaurant. The men in the lobby who moved like soldiers waiting for instructions. The conclusion forming in her mind felt almost surreal. Antonio Bandini was not simply a wealthy businessman with dangerous enemies. He was something far more powerful. The elevator doors opened directly into a private penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire Chicago skyline stretching endlessly into the darkness. The living room was expansive, designed with the kind of restrained elegance usually seen only in architecture magazines. Minimalist furniture, clean lines, carefully placed lighting that made the space feel both luxurious and strategic. It looked less like a home and more like a command center disguised as one. A woman emerged from the kitchen area as they entered. She moved with quiet confidence, her dark hair tied neatly behind her head, her posture straight and composed. "Mr. Bandini," she said. Then she turned toward Elena. "Miss Morrison." Elena blinked in surprise. "You know my name?" The woman offered a polite smile. "Of course." Antonio removed his jacket and placed it on the back of a chair. "Elena," he said, turning toward her again. There was something different in his voice now. Not softer exactly, but more direct. "You should understand something. He paused, as if deciding how much truth to reveal. The men you noticed tonight were not amateurs. They belonged to someone who has been trying to remove me from the city's business landscape for quite some time. Elena felt a chill run through her spine. And by warning me, Antonio continued calmly, you changed the outcome of that plan. She swallowed slowly. What does that mean? Antonio's eyes held her steadily. It means, he said, that until we understand exactly who ordered tonight's attack, you are no longer just a waitress who happened to be in the wrong place. He paused. You are someone my enemies now know exists. The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. Elena suddenly understood why the car had not taken her home, why the guards had appeared in the restaurant, why this penthouse felt less like luxury and more like a fortress. Because in Antonio Bandini's world, safety did not mean comfort. Safety meant control. And from this moment forward, Elena Morrison's life had become part of that control, whether she wanted it to be or not. And that was the moment when the story stopped feeling like a strange night and started revealing the truth of the world Elena had unknowingly stepped into. For the first time since leaving the Golden Fork, the silence inside the penthouse carried a different kind of weight. Not the quiet luxury of expensive walls and distant city lights, but the quiet of realization. Elena stood near the window overlooking Chicago, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath the dark sky, and tried to process what Antonio had just told her. Someone had tried to kill him. That much she had already suspected. But now another truth was settling in. Antonio Bandini was not simply a man who survived danger. He was a man whose life was built around it. What exactly do you mean by your enemies? Elena asked slowly. Antonio studied her for a moment before answering. His expression did not carry arrogance or pride, which somehow made his words even more unsettling. There are people in this city who believe power is something that should belong to them, he said calmly. Sometimes those people prefer negotiation. Sometimes they prefer removing obstacles. And you're the obstacle. Antonio's lips curved faintly, though the expression held no humor. That depends on who you ask. Elena crossed her arms, her mind moving quickly through the pieces she had gathered since the night began. The restaurant surveillance. The quiet efficiency of the men who intervened. The security in the lobby. The way everyone in the building had reacted to Antonio's presence with instinctive discipline. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. You're not just some businessman with rivals, she said carefully. Antonio did not deny it. He walked slowly toward the window beside her, his reflection appearing faintly in the glass against the sea of city lights. My family has operated in Chicago for a long time, he said. Restaurants, logistics, security consulting. Legal businesses that provide services people rely on every day. He paused. But like many families that built their influence decades ago, there are other layers to that history. Elena turned toward him. Organized crime. Antonio met her gaze directly. Yes. The word did not echo dramatically through the room. It landed quietly, almost matter-of-fact, like a truth that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. For a moment Elena said nothing. She had studied criminal organizations before. She had read about their structures, their codes of loyalty, their rivalries. But reading about something in a textbook is very different from standing face to face with a man who lives inside that world. And the men at the restaurant tonight? She asked. Working for someone who believes removing me would make his own position stronger. Antonio's tone remained steady, but Elena noticed something subtle in his posture. The slight tightening of his shoulders. The way his eyes continued scanning the room, even while speaking to her. A man who had survived long enough to lead a criminal organization did not relax easily. You didn't seem surprised, Elena said quietly. Antonio glanced toward her. About the attack? Yes. He considered the question for a moment. When you live in my position, he said finally, you learn to expect that someone, somewhere, is always calculating how to remove you. There was no drama in his voice. Just acceptance. That realization unsettled Elena more than the gunshots earlier that night. Violence could be sudden, explosive, chaotic, but living with the constant expectation of it required a different kind of endurance. You expected something like this eventually, she said. I expected something, Antonio replied. Tonight simply happened to be the night. Elena studied him carefully. People who build power in dangerous worlds often carry a specific kind of psychological armor. They learn to compartmentalize fear. to reduce threats to strategy, to convert emotion into calculation. But beneath that armor, there is almost always a story. And Elena, trained to read people, could sense one hidden beneath Antonio's calm. "Why do you trust me enough to tell me this?" she asked. Antonio's eyes lingered on her longer this time. "I don't trust easily." "That's not really an answer." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." For a moment, he looked back toward the city beyond the glass. "When I was 15, he said slowly, "my mother died." Elena didn't interrupt. She was poisoned. The words were delivered with such calm precision that they took a moment to sink in. "Someone close to our family had been selling information for years," Antonio continued. "Someone we believed was loyal." Elena felt a chill run through her. "Your father found out?" "Yes." "And what happened to the person responsible?" Antonio turned slightly toward her again. "My father handled the situation." His tone suggested the matter had been resolved long ago. But there was something else in his expression now, something deeper than anger. "Memory. That experience teaches you something," Antonio said after a moment. "What?" "That betrayal rarely announces itself loudly." Elena understood immediately why he had said that. Because earlier that night, she had noticed something others had missed. 3 men pretending not to watch. Their target. "You read behavior," Antonio said. "You noticed the pattern, and that saved your life." Antonio nodded once. "That is not something I ignore." The room fell quiet again. Elena looked back out across the city, realizing how strange the situation had become. Just a few hours earlier, she had been serving wine to strangers. Now she was standing inside a penthouse belonging to a man whose life existed at the center of a dangerous network she had only ever studied from a distance. And yet, something inside her mind refused to label Antonio simply as a criminal. Because people are rarely that simple. They are shaped by loss, by survival, by the systems they grow up inside. And sometimes, the line between villain and protector becomes far more complicated than anyone expects. Antonio stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Your warning tonight changed more than you realize." Elena met his gaze. "How so?" Antonio's eyes held a quiet intensity. "In my world," he said, "people who save your life become part of the story." He paused. "And stories like mine rarely allow their characters to walk away untouched." Elena felt the truth of those words settle deep in her chest. Because whether she wanted it or not, the moment she warned Antonio Bandini in that restaurant had already tied her life to his in ways neither of them fully understood yet. And somewhere in the shadows of Chicago, someone else had already begun calculating what that connection might mean. And once Elena understood that she had stepped into Antonio Bandini's story, the world around her began to reveal just how expensive that single decision had been. For a few days, life attempted something resembling normality, at least on the surface. Antonio insisted Elena remain in the penthouse until his people confirmed the situation in the city had stabilized. The word insisted might sound gentle, but anyone who observed Antonio long enough understood that his calm requests carried the weight of final decisions. Yet strangely, Elena did not feel imprisoned. Confused, yes. Overwhelmed, certainly. But Antonio did not treat her like someone who had been taken against her will. Instead, he spoke to her with a kind of quiet respect that made their situation even more complicated. He did not hide what his life was. He did not pretend his world was safe. He simply allowed Elena to see it. That alone revealed something important about Antonio Bandini. Powerful men often hide the machinery of their power. Antonio seemed to do the opposite. He allowed Elena to observe the system around him, as if he were curious what conclusions she would reach. And Elena did observe. She watched how the people in Antonio's circle interacted. The quiet signals between the men who handled security. The subtle changes in posture when Antonio entered a room. The way conversations shifted, not because he demanded attention, but because everyone instinctively adjusted to his presence. Authority, Elena realized, did not always look loud. Sometimes it looked like gravity. Eventually Antonio allowed her to return briefly to her job at the Golden Fork, though the word, allowed, again revealed the strange balance of their situation. Elena could go back, but she would not be alone. A man named Marco began sitting at a corner table every evening she worked. He looked like any other quiet customer, well-dressed, polite, rarely speaking. But Elena quickly recognized the signs. He wasn't there for dinner. He was there for her. At first, Elena resisted the idea that she needed protection, but it didn't take long for reality to intervene again. The second attack did not come with whispered phone calls or suspicious men watching from across the room. It came suddenly. Elena had just finished her shift one night and stepped into the dimly lit parking lot behind the restaurant when the sharp crack of breaking glass split the silence. For a moment, her brain struggled to understand what had happened. Then Marco's voice shouted from behind her. Down! The next seconds moved with terrifying speed. Another shot struck the pavement near the cars. Marco pulled Elena behind a delivery truck as the sound of footsteps echoed across the lot. Elena felt the cold shock of realization ripple through her body. Someone was trying to take her. Not kill her. Take her. That distinction mattered more than Elena wanted to admit. Because being captured meant leverage. And leverage meant she had become a piece in a conflict she barely understood. Marco reacted with professional calm, speaking rapidly into a hidden communication device while positioning himself between Elena and the open lot. Within minutes, additional security vehicles arrived. Antonio's people moved with the same quiet efficiency Elena had witnessed the night they met. The attackers disappeared just as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind shattered glass, frightened silence, and a realization Elena could no longer ignore. Antonio had been right. The moment she warned him in that restaurant, her life had changed permanently. Later that night, sitting in the penthouse living room with a glass of water she barely touched, Elena felt the emotional weight of everything finally begin to surface. Antonio entered the room quietly. You're safe, he said. The words should have comforted her. Instead, Elena looked at him with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Safe? She said. Antonio paused. You think this is safe? Her voice was not loud, but it carried the kind of frustration that builds slowly inside someone who has spent too long trying to stay rational. I had a normal life a week ago, Elena continued. I had a job, a routine, a future that made sense. Now people are trying to abduct me in parking lots. Antonio did not interrupt. That's because of you, she said. The sentence hung between them. Antonio nodded slowly. Yes. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. He simply acknowledged the truth. And strangely, that honesty made Elena's anger even harder to maintain. Because Antonio was not pretending to be innocent. He was simply living inside a reality where danger followed power the same way shadows follow light. But the real fracture between them came a few days later. It began with a folder. Sophia placed it carefully on the marble kitchen counter one morning while Elena was drinking coffee. There's something you should understand, Sophia said calmly. Elena opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Crime scene photographs. A young man lay on the floor of a small apartment, his face peaceful in the stillness that only comes after violence. For a moment Elena couldn't place him. Then recognition hit her like a physical blow. Jimmy Torino. He had been a delivery driver from a restaurant where Elena used to work months earlier. He was polite, friendly, the kind of guy who remembered people's names and asked about their day. What happened to him? Elena whispered. Sophia's voice remained steady. He was providing information to people connected with Ricardo Torino's organization. Elena's hands tightened around the edge of the counter. What kind of information? Your work schedule, your previous address, details about your family. The room suddenly felt smaller. He didn't know what they were planning, Elena said quickly. He was probably just trying to make extra money. Sophia met her eyes. Perhaps. Elena swallowed. Where is Antonio? In his office. Elena didn't hesitate. She walked straight down the hallway and pushed the office door open. Antonio looked up from the desk. Elena, you killed him. Antonio did not ask who she meant. Yes, he said calmly. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. He was 24. Elena said, her voice trembling now. He worked 2 jobs. He was trying to pay off student loans. He was selling information that would have led to your kidnapping. He didn't understand that. Antonio stood slowly. Elena, in my world. In your world, people just disappear when they become inconvenient. The anger in her voice surprised even her. Antonio's expression hardened slightly, though his tone remained controlled. In my world, he said quietly. If someone provides intelligence that endangers the people under my protection, I remove that threat permanently. Elena stared at him. You're talking about a human life, like it's a business decision. That's exactly what it was. The simplicity of his answer felt almost unbearable. You could have talked to him, Elena said. You could have paid him to stop. You could have helped him. Antonio shook his head. You're still looking at this situation as if people always deserve second chances. And they don't. Not when those chances get others killed. The room fell silent. Elena realized in that moment that she had been trying to separate two versions of Antonio in her mind. The man who protected her, and the man capable of ordering someone's death. But the truth was far more uncomfortable. They were the same person. I can't do this, Elena whispered. Antonio's eyes narrowed slightly. Do what? Live inside your world. The words were painful to say, but once they were spoken, Elena knew they were true. Because loving someone powerful is easy when you only see their protection. It becomes much harder when you see the cost of that protection. I'm leaving, she said. Antonio did not move. For a moment Elena thought he might try to stop her, but instead he simply said, very quietly, You think leaving will protect you? Elena didn't answer, because deep down, she wasn't sure anymore what protection even meant. And somewhere in the city beyond the penthouse walls, the consequences of that decision were already beginning to move into place. And yet, the strange truth about walking away from someone like Antonio Bandini is that distance does not always create safety. It sometimes only reveals how deeply the connection had already taken root. For a while, Elena believed leaving had restored something in her life. She found a small apartment in Detroit, a quiet place above a bakery that opened before sunrise and filled the morning air with the warm smell of bread and sugar. It was far enough from Chicago to feel like a clean break. A different skyline, different streets, different faces. On the surface, the life she built there looked ordinary again. She found temporary work assisting a behavioral research project at a local university. The work was familiar territory, studying decision-making patterns, analyzing how people interpret risk and loyalty. It should have been comforting. It should have felt like returning to the version of herself she had once planned to become. But the mind has a strange habit of comparing what it has known with what it has lost. Elena noticed it in quiet moments. When she walked home at night and realized she no longer checked reflections in store windows to see if someone was following her. When she sat in cafes without scanning every exit door. When she realized the silence around her was not the kind of silence that comes from control, but simply the absence of danger. For most people, that kind of normal life is a relief. For Elena, it sometimes felt like something was missing. Not the violence, not the tension, but the strange clarity that had existed in Antonio's world. In that world, every action had purpose. Every conversation carried weight. Every decision meant something. Here, life simply drifted. And then the call came. It arrived late in the evening while Elena was reviewing case notes at her small kitchen table. The number on the screen belonged to Chicago. For a moment she hesitated, a quiet instinct telling her that answering might reopen a door she had worked hard to close. But when she heard the voice on the other end, hesitation disappeared. Elena. It was her sister, Jessica. Jessica sounded different. Her voice carried a tight, controlled fear that Elena had never heard before. They came to the house today. Elena felt her stomach drop. Who came? They asked questions about you. They knew your name. They knew you'd been in Chicago. The room suddenly felt colder. Jess, listen to me carefully. Did they hurt you? No. But they said something. Elena closed her eyes. What did they say? Jessica hesitated. They said if you want this to stop, you need to talk to Antonio Bandini. The name hung in the air between them. In that moment Elena understood something painful and unavoidable. Walking away had not ended the story. It had simply moved the conflict somewhere else. After the call ended, Elena sat alone for a long time. The mind does something curious when it faces impossible choices. It begins reviewing memories like evidence in a trial. Every moment, every conversation, every decision that led to the present. Antonio's quiet confidence, his brutal honesty, the way he had never once lied to her about the world he lived in, and the truth she had resisted admitting. Antonio had never tried to control her. He had simply told her what reality looked like from his side of the line. Elena picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered above the contact she had sworn she would never call again. When Antonio answered, his voice sounded exactly the same as it had the first night they met. Calm, controlled, impossible to read. Elena. He said her name as if he had expected this moment eventually. My sister, Elena said quietly. They know where she lives. Antonio was silent for a few seconds. Ricardo Torino. It wasn't a question. You knew? I suspected. Elena leaned against the counter, exhaustion pressing heavily into her shoulders. I thought leaving would end this. Antonio's voice softened slightly. In my world, leaving rarely ends anything. The words were not cruel. They were simply true. What do we do? Elena asked. Antonio answered without hesitation. You come back to Chicago. And then, we finish what they started. There was something different in his tone now. Not anger. Resolve. And for the first time since she had left, Elena felt the strange clarity returning. The kind of clarity that only appears when life narrows down to a single path forward. Because sometimes love does not grow in peaceful places. Sometimes it grows in the moments when two people realize they are stronger together than they could ever be apart. And Elena Morrison was beginning to understand that. Walking away from Antonio Bandini had never truly been an escape. It had simply been the moment before she chose, willingly this time, to step back into his world. And sometimes the most important choices in life are not the ones we make when everything is calm, but the ones we make when we finally understand exactly what kind of world we are stepping into. 2 years passed after Elena returned to Chicago. From the outside, the story people saw was simple. Antonio Bandini continued expanding the restaurant empire his family had quietly built across the city. New locations opened along the riverfront, each one elegant, profitable, and perfectly legitimate to anyone looking from the outside. But the story beneath the surface was far more complicated. Elena Morrison had changed. Not in the way people often imagine when they hear stories like this. She did not become colder, or harder, or someone unrecognizable. Instead, she became something more deliberate. Her education in behavioral psychology returned to the center of her life, but now it had a different purpose. Elena helped Antonio understand people, patterns of loyalty, signals of betrayal, the subtle human behaviors that reveal truth long before words do. In a strange way, she had found the career she once dreamed about, just inside a world she never expected to inhabit. They married quietly the following spring. No headlines. No public spectacle. Just a small ceremony attended by the few people Antonio truly trusted. And one evening, standing beside the window of the same penthouse where their story had truly begun, Elena rested her hand against her growing stomach. Their daughter would arrive in a few months. Sometimes people ask whether love can exist in dangerous worlds. After everything I've thought about while telling this story, I think the real question is something else. Not whether love can survive inside darkness, but whether two people can choose each other, fully aware of that darkness, and still decide that the life they build together is worth the cost. When you step back and look at Elena Morrison's journey from beginning to end, the story becomes about far more than a waitress meeting a powerful man. It becomes a story about awareness, choices, and the quiet moments where ordinary people discover how much strength they actually carry inside themselves. Elena did not begin this story looking for danger, power, or romance. She began simply by paying attention. In a crowded restaurant where everyone else was busy enjoying their evening, she noticed the small patterns that others ignored. A glance held too long. A man watching the exits. A whispered phone call that didn't belong in a peaceful place. That single act of awareness changed everything. It pulled her into a world she never expected to enter, forced her to confront moral dilemmas she never imagined facing, and ultimately required her to decide what kind of life she wanted to build. The truth is that life often works this way. Major turning points rarely arrive with dramatic warnings. They appear quietly, disguised as small decisions. Whether to speak up, whether to ignore something wrong, whether to walk away or stand beside someone when things become complicated. The deeper lesson from Elena's story is not about crime or danger. It is about responsibility and clarity. Elena never lost her ability to question the world around her. She challenged Antonio when his choices crossed her moral boundaries. She walked away when she felt she could not accept his world. And when she returned, it was not because she was controlled, but because she understood the consequences of every choice and decided consciously what future she wanted to build. In our own lives, we face similar moments, perhaps not as dramatic, but equally meaningful. The ability to observe carefully, think critically, and stay true to our values can change the direction of our lives more than we realize. So here is a simple question for you. Do you believe Elena made the right decision by returning to Antonio's world, or should she have stayed away and protected her old life? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your opinion in the comments so everyone watching can learn from different perspectives. And if you enjoy stories that explore human choices, psychology, and unexpected relationships, consider subscribing to Rose's Stories to support the channel and help us continue creating more stories like this in the future.